Jake Curtis is standing by from Institute for Reforming Government, and I want to talk about a report that IRG put out. But first, Jake, what I want to talk about are comments you made in an article that was posted yesterday about the smears that are being shared directly from the Susan Crawford campaign against Brad Schimmel, because they're not just smears. I mean, they're lies, and they actually could be a violation of lawyer ethics, maybe a violation of the law. What's your analysis of this?
Sure. Good morning, Vicki. Thanks for having me on. So if you look at some of the recent attacks from Judge Crawford directed at Judge Schimmel, right, there's a lot of politics going on. I get it. This is a heated campaign, lots of money flowing back and forth. But as you alluded to, there's a code of professional conduct that controls lawyer conduct. And on top of that, there's a code that relates to judicial conduct. And so you have two sitting judges. She's still a judge. Judge Schimmel is still a judge in Waukesha County. She's obviously a judge in Dane County. So they're still practicing lawyers who are judges. Therefore, they're still bound by these two separate code of ethics. And when you look at some of her recent statements, I'm not sure they're ads necessarily, they're basically just posts on X or Twitter, some of them are unbelievable. So I'm looking at one right now. Brad Schimmel has been bought off by a child predator's lawyer, opioid manufacturers, and now Elon Musk. So the Elon Musk, right, that's just politics, right? There's obviously support from the right for Judge Schimmel. There's support from people like George Soros for her. Honestly, to me, that's just politics. The one that's really problematic in my mind is Brad Schimmel has been bought off by a child predator's lawyer.
Like, this is corruption in the court is what she's alleging.
Well, so exactly. So if you look at it, if that were true, we know it's not, or there's nothing to suggest it's true. But if it were true, under the Code of Professional Conduct, lawyers have an obligation. It's a shall. They shall report misconduct that they are aware of or have knowledge of to what's called the Office of Lawyer Regulation, OLR. They have to. I mean, as a practicing lawyer, I've never had to do it, but I've certainly been involved in conversations. And look, I love a good lawyer joke, but in my experience, most lawyers are very ethical. We take our responsibilities under the Code of Professional Conduct very seriously. And if we do witness something or we become aware of some conduct from another lawyer, right, we were essentially policing ourselves. If we become aware of that, we have an obligation to report that. So if she has some knowledge that Judge Schimmel has been, quote unquote, bought off, she is under an obligation to report that. Now, A, we know that's very unlikely to be true. And B, she hasn't made a report. So then the other side of that equation would be, well, then she's knowingly running a false advertisement or making a false, let me correct that, a false political statement, which
I would say it's worse than that. I don't even think it's maybe the Elon Musk stuff is a political statement, but if she's accusing him of colluding with and conspiring with a defendant's lawyer in court, and she knows that's not true, that's defamation.
Well, that's a good point, Vicki. And one thing that was not in the Dairyland Sentinel piece is, and I don't know, maybe the author will get to this in a later piece, but there's potential criminal behavior if you are knowingly making a false political statement, which that's not some theoretical academic exercise. If you recall, that happened just last year to a conservative candidate for the assembly, I believe in Milwaukee County, and that individual ultimately entered a plea agreement, and I believe paid a fine. So, there's precedent for if a candidate goes out and makes a statement that they know to be incorrect, there are examples of prosecution. And in that case, it was wrong. It was a mistake, but it was, as you recall, that statement relating to the firing of former police chief Morales, where you could actually debate whether or not the statement was actually incorrect, in that obviously public officials who are weighing in on that contributed to the firing. But I guess in a very technical sense, it was a mistake, and the individual got prosecuted. So I guess my point is, in addition to the rules of professional conduct, there's potential criminal liability here.
Criminal liability,
so I think that's also
civil liability. It's just sleazy. So it starts at sleazy, then it potentially is civil liability, then potential criminal liability, ethics complaints. Has anyone filed an ethics complaint against her? Has anyone asked for an investigation of her conduct?
Not that I'm aware of, and I believe this is really the first analysis that's been done on it. But it's certainly something. If these statements continue to be made, that Judge Schimmel has been bought up by an attorney and opioid manufacturers, I think individuals are going to have to look at that and wonder whether or not something should be done as far as
I think they should. So I think the campaign attorneys certainly, and I don't even think of if it continues. She's made the statement. She has not retracted this statement. She has not clarified this statement. She has not apologized for this statement. This statement is out there, and it's been out there for a couple of days. And as far as that goes, she's had plenty of time to think through whether or not perhaps she misspoke in her statement. And by not going back and altering it or deleting it or clarifying it, she seems to want to stand by that statement. The media doesn't want to do anything about that. So again, on the political side, Elon Musk gives $676,000. By the way, I don't even think the Schimmel campaign knew it was coming in. $2 million minimally from J.B. Pritzker, Reid Hoffman, and George Soros have flowed into Susan Crawford's campaign. Susan Crawford was on a call with people who want to alter the congressional maps, and the New York Times made it sound like she essentially telegraphed. I say telegraphed because, promised is probably too strong a word, that she would do her best on the congressional maps were they to come before her. That starts to stink like quid pro quo. But Brad Schimmel's never said anything like that. And it was the New York Times that did the article. So here she's actually accusing him of being on the take. That's astonishing to me.
Yeah, well, the level of hypocrisy with some of her statements, it's astounding because
it's pretty disgusting.
She spends a lot of time pointing out the support from the right for Judge Schimmel, and to your point, Vicki, just completely oblivious to the fact that she's getting significant funding from progressive donors. And then to your point, that New York Times piece was astounding.
It got no attention here. It got no attention in the Wisconsin media.
It got picked up nationally because I think people realize this race is bigger, frankly, than just Wisconsin. We're obviously the most critical swing state, so I think that's why some people have paid attention. But
not
I think
here
that
in Wisconsin. We're the voters. We're the ones who matter, and the Wisconsin media has pretended like that story didn't happen. I do think it helped Elon Musk understand that his PAC perhaps had to pay attention to Wisconsin, though.
Right. No, there's national implications here, as you alluded to. You could honestly make the argument that the balance of Congress, the majority, is really at stake here in the spring election because she's basically telegraphing, how she would rule on the case, which, frankly, Vicki, is another potential violation. Nobody seems to really dig into this, but under there's two separate codes that relate to professional conduct, but also judicial conduct. We have a separate code just for judges. And if you look back at 23, the statements made by Justice Protasiewicz and now Judge Crawford, they're telegraphing how they are going to rule on cases. I know that would be really difficult to prove, but I just wish these candidates would take it seriously. And look, I track what Judge Schimmel says, and I don't think he's doing the same thing, right? He talks about his judicial philosophy, which is frankly what these elections should be about. Are they about your values? Or are they about how you actually interpret the law? I obviously support the latter. You support the latter. But let's have that debate as opposed to how we're actually going to rule on decisions, which I think is a violation of the code of judicial conduct.
I want to say this because I've had Judge Schimmel on the air a number of times. And, before the segments, I'll pick up the phone and I'll say, what do you think about X, Y, or Z? I've asked him about cases. He refuses to tell me privately before we go on the air. He doesn't telegraph anything to me. So I just want to put that out there, is that, if you could have a conversation, it's not being monitored. Oh, yeah, this is how I'll rule in X, Y, or Z. Schimmel refuses to do it. Refuses to do that, even in given an opportunity where he can do that. He won't do it, and so that ought to tell you a lot about how seriously he takes his role as a judge and as a candidate for the state's highest court. And here you've got the Crawford campaign essentially advertising how she's going to rule on cases. And Jake, you're a lawyer, but what if I'm a defendant? I know exactly how the Wisconsin Supreme Court would rule on a case if the case involved elections, regulation, taxation, free speech. I know exactly, because of what my political persuasion is, what my outcome would be. I shouldn't know whether or not I've got a slam dunk in a court.
Right, and that's exactly right. Sometimes we get very fixated on the actual rules, but I think that's an important point you're making. If you take a step back, and I always encourage when you're looking at a law or statute or code, kind of what's the point, right? And obviously the point is we have all these rules in place for lawyers and judges and justices, because ultimately the most important thing is that when you're in a court of law, when you're having your case heard, when you're making your arguments, that you feel that the justices, the judges, are actually objectively reviewing the facts and the arguments in front of them. And when litigants don't have that sense of fairness, we have a very fundamental problem. And look, you can point to examples in the past where, from a policy standpoint, conservatives wanted one outcome, and the court, even under a conservative majority, maybe ruled a different way. And I think we have to be objective to point out there are going to be situations like that where the law, from a technical sense, just isn't on our side when it comes from from the policy standpoint, and that's okay. But I think, to your point, Vicki, I would really struggle to point to a decision under the progressive majority that didn't match exactly what the preferred policy outcome was. And that's a problem.
Regardless of constitutionality, that's the thing. Is we've seen things that are just, they make no sense. Regardless of precedent, regardless of constitutionality, regardless of the intentions of the legislature, we've already seen that. And that's what Susan Crawford is telegraphing. But, fine, you want to advertise that you're going to be part of a rigged court. An imbalanced court, by the way, is not a court that metes out justice in any meaningful definition of the word. But don't lie about your opponent. Don't accuse Brad Schimmel of being in the back pocket of the lawyers of child predators. If you're going to make those kinds of accusations, prove it. Otherwise, shut up and apologize. Honestly, this is one that's so bad. It's so reputationally damaging. I hope the Schimmel team does something about it.
Yeah, I do too. And if I could just make sure to get my plug in, that at IRG, Institute for Reforming Government, we have a Court Watch project. We rolled it out a few weeks ago. We kind of are officially rolling it out this week. We are going to be focused on all these cases. Again, we're a C3, so we're not getting involved in any sort of campaign or election. We're just focused on the cases, and we're objectively looking at the cases. And, Vicki, you made a really important point. I think what's happening right now is we have a fundamental difference of opinion taking place right now in this election, where you have the left who believes that the court's role is to, apply their values to legislative decisions, and if a legislative decision is not consistent with their values, they overturn it. That's not an original or textual approach. Frankly, there's nothing really in the Constitution to suggest that. And what we've been pointing out is you have these cases where it's called rational basis review. Is there any reason that the legislature had to pass a bill, an act? And if there is, then the courts should respect that.
Yep.
I know you had me on to talk about Act 10. Ultimately, there was a very rational reason for why the legislature passed Act 10, and Governor Walker signed it. Maybe later this week or next week we can talk about kind of a recent primer. We put out a primer every single week. We've been talking about some of the tort reforms that were passed under Governor Walker. Everybody talks about Act 10. I talk about Act 21, the admin reform. Act 2, if people remember, was that huge package of reforms that really changed Wisconsin from being a tort, pardon the French, hellhole, and just a plaintiff's attorney just haven to a more reasonable, more business-oriented approach with economic damage caps, making sure expert testimony was actually expert testimony, and that's all at risk here.
Everything's at risk. The Wisconsin Rains Act is at risk. The Agriculture Manufacturer Tax Credit is at risk. Act 35 is at risk. Project labor agreements are at risk. Right to work is at risk. Everything's at risk. The congressional maps are at risk. Go to reforminggovernment.org, reforminggovernment.org. Jake Curtis, a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Vicki.
Great to have you.